In the autumn of 1944, the war in Europe had reached a moment of profound strategic tension that would shape the final months of the campaign, and that would define the relationship between the two most important American commanders of the Western Front, in ways that neither of them could fully resolve while the war was still being fought. Patton's Third Army had completed one of the most extraordinary advances in the history of modern warfare. From the breakout at Avranches in late July through the drive across France that had covered in weeks the ground that the planning estimates had allocated months for. The Third Army had moved at a pace that had left German units encircled and destroyed, and that had brought American forces to the German border faster than anyone in the Allied High Command had believed was possible when the Normandy landings were being planned. Not because of German resistance, not because of operational failure, not because of any decision made by Patton or by the officers commanding the Third Army's corps and divisions. The advance stopped because the fuel ran out. And the fuel ran out because of a decision made at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. A decision that Patton's staff believed had been made at the direct expense of the Third Army, and that several of them believed had been made with a deliberateness that went beyond the ordinary compromises of coalition logistics. The decision was the allocation of fuel and supply priority to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group in the north for the operation that would become known as Market Garden. Montgomery had argued with the particular persistence that characterized his dealings with Eisenhower that a single concentrated thrust in the north could end the war in 1944 by crossing the Rhine and driving into the heart of Germany before the German army could reconstitute itself after the disasters of the summer. Eisenhower had accepted this argument, at least partially, and the consequence of that acceptance was that the fuel and supplies that might have kept Patton's Third Army moving east were redirected north. Patton understood the logistics. He was not a man who misunderstood logistics. He had spent his career studying the relationship between supply and operational tempo, and he knew better than almost anyone in the Allied command how completely an army's ability to move depended on its ability to be supplied. He knew that Eisenhower faced genuine constraints and genuine competing demands, and that the decisions being made at SHAEF were not made in a vacuum of indifference to operational reality. What he could not accept, and what he did not pretend to accept, was the specific choice that had been made. He believed that the Third Army's advance represented the best opportunity available to end the war in 1944, that the ground being covered and the damage being done to the German army in the south was of greater strategic value than what Montgomery's forces were achieving or were likely to achieve in the north, and that the decision to prioritize Montgomery was not a neutral logistical calculation, but a choice with consequences that would cost lives and extend the war. He said all of this repeatedly and with characteristic directness through the proper channels available to him. He argued his case to his immediate superior, General Omar Bradley. He argued it in communications with SHAEF. He argued it with the particular combination of operational specificity and personal intensity that made his arguments both compelling and, to those who had to manage him within a coalition command structure, exhausting. The arguments did not change the decision. Market Garden went forward. It failed at Arnhem in the way that Patton had predicted operations based on Montgomery's operational style tended to fail, and the war that might have ended in 1944 continued into 1945. It was in this context, in the weeks after Arnhem, and during the period when the Third Army was rebuilding its supply position and preparing for the next phase of operations, that the conversation happened. The officer was a colonel on the Third Army staff, a man who had been with Patton long enough to speak with a degree of frankness that junior officers did not attempt, and that even senior officers calibrated carefully. He was not a man given to dramatic statements, and the weight he gave to what he said reflected genuine conviction rather than the desire to provoke a reaction. He told Patton that what had happened with the supply allocation was not a neutral decision made under genuine constraint. He told him that the people around Eisenhower, the British officers, and the political considerations that shaped decisions at SHAEF had made a deliberate choice to limit the Third Army's advance. Because of Patton victory, a clean American breakthrough that ended the war before Montgomery had a chance to play the role he believed history had assigned him, was not an outcome that everyone at SHAEF had been equally interested in achieving. He said that Eisenhower had betrayed him, not through malice, perhaps, but through a failure of the moral clarity that the situation had required, a willingness to let coalition politics and personal relationships with British commanders shape decisions that should have been made purely on operational grounds. He said that Patton deserved better from the man who had been his friend for 20 years, and that the soldiers of the Third Army deserved better from the Supreme Commander, whose job was to win the war as quickly and as completely as possible. Patton listened to all of this. The colonel, having said what he came to say, waited for the response. What he got was not what he expected. Patton was quiet for a moment. Then he said that the colonel was wrong, and he said it in a tone that made clear he was not being diplomatic or performatively generous, but that he had thought carefully about this and had arrived at a conclusion he was prepared to defend. He said that Eisenhower had not betrayed him. He said that Eisenhower was doing the hardest job in the war, a job that Patton himself would not have wanted and would not have been suited for, and that the decisions being made at SHAEF were being made under constraints that Patton, operating at the Army level with a single clear operational mission, did not fully have to carry. He said that commanding an alliance was not the same as commanding an army. He said that Eisenhower was not just commanding American forces. He was managing the political relationships between nations, the egos of commanders who represented those nations and who brought to their commands the full weight of their country's expectations and histories, and the particular sensitivities of a coalition that needed to hold together not just for the duration of the current operation, but for the duration of the war and for whatever came after the war. He said that Montgomery was a problem, a genuine operational and personal problem that anyone who had to work with him understood intimately, but that Montgomery was also the commander of British forces at a moment when Britain's continued full commitment to the coalition was not something that could be taken for granted, and that Eisenhower's management of Montgomery, however frustrating it was to watch from the outside, reflected a reality that did not disappear because it was inconvenient. Then he said something that the colonel recorded and that appears in the accounts of several officers who were present, or who heard about the conversation from those who were. He said that he had spent a significant amount of time during the supply crisis being angry at Eisenhower, and that the anger had been genuine and had been based on a real conviction that the wrong decision had been made, and that he did not intend to pretend that the decision had been correct, because it had not been correct, and the results at Arnhem had confirmed that it had not been correct. But he said that there was a difference between a wrong decision and a betrayal. He said that betrayal required intent, a conscious choice to harm someone who had trusted you, and that what Eisenhower had done was not that. What Eisenhower had done was make a wrong call under conditions of genuine uncertainty and competing pressures, and that wrong calls under those conditions were not the same as betrayal, even when their consequences were serious. He said that he had known Eisenhower for 20 years. He said that in 20 years he had seen Eisenhower make decisions he disagreed with, and had argued against those decisions with everything he had, and had sometimes been overruled, and had accepted being overruled because that was how command structures worked, and because his conviction that he was right did not automatically mean that he was right. He said that in 20 years he had never seen Eisenhower make a decision that was motivated by anything other than what Eisenhower genuinely believed was the right thing to do, given the information and the pressures he was working with. He said that this was not a small thing. He said that in the senior leadership of any large organization, military or otherwise, the number of people who made decisions based on what they genuinely believed was right, rather than on what was convenient or politically safe or personally advantageous, was smaller than it should be, and that Eisenhower was in that smaller group, and that this mattered even when the decisions that came out of the process were wrong. He said that the word betrayal was a word that should be used carefully, and that using it about Eisenhower was not careful. It was the word of a man who was angry and who had confused his anger with a moral judgment, and that the colonel's anger was understandable, but that the moral judgment it had produced was not accurate. Then he said that the conversation they were having was not one that should be repeated, not because it was secret in any formal sense, but because the kind of talk that described the supreme commander as a man who had betrayed his subordinates was the kind of talk that corroded the command relationships that the Army needed to function, and that whatever his private frustrations with the decisions being made at SHAEF, he was not going to be the source of that corrosion, and he was not going to allow it to develop in his headquarters. He said that the Third Army's job was to fight. He said that the supply situation was improving, and that the next phase of operations would give the Third Army the opportunity to demonstrate again what it was capable of, and that the best response to the decisions he disagreed with was not bitterness and accusations of betrayal, but performance so unambiguous that the arguments about allocation and priority would answer themselves. He said that he intended to make those arguments answer themselves, and he said that when they did, when the Third Army had done what he knew it was capable of doing in the months ahead, the question of who had been right about the strategic situation in the autumn of 1944 would not require any further discussion. The colonel left the conversation with a different understanding of the man he had been serving than he had brought into it. He had come expecting either agreement, which would have confirmed his own judgment, or dismissal, which would have told him that Patton was unwilling to face the reality of his situation. What he got was something more complicated and more honest than either. A man who held his anger and his loyalty and his operational judgment in a relationship with each other that was neither simple nor comfortable, but that was, the colonel came to believe, the reason Patton was the commander he was. The months that followed produced exactly what Patton had said they would produce. The Third Army's advance through the autumn and winter and into the spring of 1945, through the Lorraine campaign and the Battle of the Bulge relief, and the crossing of the Rhine and the drive into Germany, constituted an operational record that made the arguments of the autumn of 1944 irrelevant in the way that Patton had said they would be made irrelevant. The relationship between Patton and Eisenhower never became simple. It had never been simple. 20 years of friendship between two men of strong and different characters played out against the background of the most consequential war in history could not produce simplicity. There were continued disagreements and continued frustrations, and moments when the relationship was tested by pressures that neither of them had any control over. But the word that the colonel had used, betrayal, was not a word that Patton ever applied to Eisenhower. He applied plenty of other words in his diary and in conversations with his staff. Words that reflected genuine frustration and genuine disagreement, and the particular irritation of a man who believed he understood the operational situation better than the people making the decisions about it. Betrayal was not among them, and the distinction, as Patton had explained to the colonel on that autumn day in 1944, was not a small one. So, do you agree with Patton's view that Eisenhower made the wrong call, but did not betray him? Or do you think coalition politics got in the way of winning the war faster? Share your opinion in the comments section below. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story of true historical justice. Thank you for watching. Respect the fallen, honor the veterans, and never forget history. We will see you in the next video.